Perfect. So again, welcome everyone to our Leading with Confidence Board of Director Training Foundations for Recovery Community Organizations. We're at the top of the hour, so as people keep coming in, we are going to start the presentation. And while we're kind of going through our initial housekeeping slides, feel free to write in the chat your role, your organization, and then maybe where you're tuning in from, so we get an idea of how far our reach is. We're excited for this training. It's been a long time coming. So we can go to the next slide. So just a note that the funding for this training was made possible through a SAMHSA grant, and the views expressed within this training are those of the presenter and not necessarily those of the Department of Health and Human Services. Next slide. Just a reminder that the Peer Recovery Center of Excellence, who is hosting this training, focuses on 4 core areas. So we look at the integration of peer support workers into different settings. We look at, sorry, I think 2 of us are doing admitting to the room, so I'm distracted. It's okay, you keep doing it, Cindy, while I talk. Our second area is working with recovery community organizations and building their capacity. So that is a part of this training, today's training. We look at offering opportunities to enhance the peer recovery workforce through different trainings, resources, and technical assistance. And then in our 4th area, we look at expanding and making available evidence-based practices to the workforce. And so those are kind of the 4 buckets that we work within. Next slide, please. And of course, if we want addiction destigmatized, we need a language that's unified. The words we use matter. Caution needs to be taken, especially when the disorders concerned are heavily stigmatized, such as substance use disorders are. And so this is just a reminder that we never want to describe somebody as their disease or their diagnosis, and always see them as a person first, that human being sitting in front of us. We'll go to the next slide. So just a little bit of housekeeping. We are recording today's session, and it'll be made available to the public at our website, on our website. So you can always come back and review everything you heard today, and then you can share it with people you think it would benefit, especially if you're working with the board. Hopefully it's a great tool that you can pass on to them. If you're not speaking, please try to keep your line muted. We will take some really pressing questions during the presentation time, but we've allotted a fair amount of time at the end to address questions. But do feel free to put them into the chat or use the raise hand function. If something's really pressing, we can get to it right away. Otherwise, feel free to make a note or jot it down, and we can come to it at the end as well. And then feel free to add your comments to the chat as we're going through today's presentation. And we'll go to the next slide, which I think is where I hand it off to you, Stephen. So I'm going to let Stephen introduce himself, and we're really grateful you're here with us. And I'm excited to jump right in.
Well, Chris, thank you so much for having me. Cindy, thank you for getting me in today. Really grateful for that. And welcome, everybody. It's awesome to see folks from all around the country. I saw Michigan, Texas, I saw Minnesota, New York. That's fantastic, folks. And I hope what we can do today is just give you a good sort of board development 101 background. And let me tell you who I am so you understand the person that's in front of you. As I said, my name is Stephen Samra. I'm a senior associate with C4 Innovations, and I've been with those folks for about almost 13 years now. That's amazing to me, just because I never had a job longer than 3 years. It's pretty awesome. That's recovery. And I love being in recovery. I am a person in long-term recovery from what I call the Big Five. But my primary diagnosis is really an opioid use disorder. I deal with some serious mental health issues. I have a bipolar disorder, severe ADHD, which is why most of the time I script out what I'm going to do, because I'll talk for hours. I'm also justice involved. I spent a couple of years in prison for a nonviolent cannabis crime. And I've been homeless off and on through, I don't know, probably the last 40 years. And finally, I'm a trauma survivor, and my ACE score is actually a 9. So again, it's just, it's great to be here with everybody. I have sent a few resources over to Chris. None of them are going to be required for this session, but I'm hoping that they're going to provide some good info long after I'm gone. So we've made it through the housekeeping, and before we really get into today's stuff, I put together the objectives that are in front of you. And I did it intentionally for today because it's been my experience that all the things that you're about to hear and learn about, really about running and managing a nonprofit, all the challenges that we recognize and many that we don't, all the barriers. I've been doing this for 15 years. And almost every single peer-run organization that I have dealt with has experienced almost exactly the same thing here. So as you hear me and you're thinking, wow, I'll never find time to do it all. Yeah, you will. And almost everybody else that I've worked with said exactly the same. So just take it slow. You're building this plane while you're kind of flying it. It takes time, experience, and support. And just keep in mind, too, this is a really basic training. There is a ton of information that's online. There are some more advanced trainings that are available, and almost all of them really are either free or at very low cost. So we're going to dive in, okay? And unfortunately, we're diving in right off the bat with a test. So I know that's not what everybody was really excited to do. And I do apologize for throwing this little pop quiz at you all, but I want to go through this pre-training assessment just as a way that we can all check, our knowledge when we hit the end of this. So I'm going to move through these questions fairly quickly. Just use the chat, and really it's a true or false question, right? So the board is formally recognized as a legal entity responsible for the organization. True or false? And again, just throw your T's or F's into that chat, and we'll move through these. A conflict of interest or unethical behavior might be grounds for removing an individual from the board. Many boards establish not only board terms, but also term limits, such as 2-year terms with a limit of 3 consecutive terms, for example. Can boards fire an executive director? True or false? The executive director doesn't report to the board of directors. An annual assessment provides a straightforward way for board members to provide feedback on the executive directors and the organization's performance. You guys are on it. Thank you. I'm just watching the T's and the F's coming flying through here. Boards bear no fundraising responsibilities. The role of a board committee is to prepare recommendations for the board's approval. Constituency, skills, gender, sexual orientation, race, and ethnic background, all important characteristics to consider when recruiting for a board. And then the final question. Governance refers to directing the day-to-day administrative and programmatic activities. True or false? All right, so we're going to go find out exactly whether or not those were true and false. And I want to thank everybody for just using the chat really quickly and getting us through this pretty painlessly. All right, so we're going to get to the main course on our board buffet today. And this board that we're speaking of, it's really made up of members who are responsible for the legal and the fiduciary oversight of the organization that it's governing. And as that fiduciary, and we're going to talk more about what that means in a minute, as the fiduciary, the board as a body and each individual board member, well, they always have to act for the good of the nonprofit. And again, we're going to talk more about that shortly too. The board is expected to exercise due diligence, that the organization is well managed, and they often are expected to play a fundraising role, but a real successful board is going to go beyond these functions, and they will lead an organization in really defining and, I think more importantly, achieving that core mission that the organization is is in existence for. There's not a magic formula here. And board leadership really involves more than just setting some goals. It really needs to be continuous, and it is a multi-phase kind of process. It requires us to plan, it requires oversight, and it requires these revisiting, so that if there's some mods that we need, some modifications that we need to make, some revisions, some tweaks to it, we can do that. And the board then provides oversight of the staff as they actually implement the strategic plan. And in addition, during the assessment phase, the board should provide critical assessments of the success of the organization, the programs and services that operate within it, as well as the board's own performance. So let's get a better handle on what all this means. So in order for a nonprofit organization to really achieve that mission as a human change agent, you got to understand the community that you're operating in, and then the challenges that are within that community. And we get at that information using 4 questions. And really, they're based on the key components that we need in a nonprofit board. So are we moving in the direction that we ultimately want to go? And new boards are often brought on, to a startup organization that's been operating with a volunteer base. And it's based typically on the vision of the founder. And our founders often assume that, the mission is self-evident, but it's not always the case. And one of the most important responsibilities of a board really is to develop or revise the mission statement in a way that really solidly links that organization's vision to what it's doing and what the services are that they're providing. Does our strategic plan reflect and support the mission? Well, we know a solid strategic plan ought to be used to guide program activities, to allocate the resources that we need, and then really to assess the organization's achievements. A good strat plan or a good strategic plan should also provide staff and leaders with guidelines around establishing the organization's program of activities, allocating human and financial resources to get those activities done, and assess whether we're meeting the objectives that we put forth. And finally, we need to evaluate these programs and the staff and the resources. The strategic plan focuses on the what, but the work plan focuses on how to carry out the goals and objectives we're finding in that strategic plan. The staff will prepare the bulk of that plan, but there'll be guidance and then final approval that comes from the board. And the plan also identifies who's going to be responsible, what the timelines are, who's doing the resources and what does that look like, and what's the evaluation plan going to look like that actually identifies some real specific and measurable outcomes that the mission of the organization wants to achieve. And then finally, the board is absolutely accountable for the organization's success or the failure. And the board's got to measure the progress of the organization against those goals that we put into the strategic and the strategic plan and the work plan too. We got to measure the performance of the ED, the executive director, and excuse me. And together, we're assisting and supporting an organization in a very consistent and positive way throughout the entire year. The board needs to use the results of the annual assessment in order to make some adjustments, some tweaks to the mission, the planning if necessary, and how we actually implement the programmatic operations of the organization itself. A strong board needs to be attentive to some really important responsibilities, and it's against those standards that we're going to measure how effective the board is. And you're seeing here the order of priority and wording of these responsibilities. It could vary between different organizations, and I would say though most folks agree that these descriptors here really accurately kind of capture what the obligations are for board members. And while the number of responsibilities varies, again, depending on who's drafting them, I'm going to share 12 of these responsibilities And they're organized here into sort of four overarching buckets. Now, we've already touched on just briefly on a couple of them, but these responsibilities include direction. We need to establish organizational mission, vision, and strategic direction. We look at the mission, vision, and core values of our organization. And then we need to approve the strategic and operating plans of the organization. In terms of capacity, do we have it? I mean, part of it is assuring that we have adequate organizational capacity. We need to recruit and select the chief executive, evaluate that, this executive director's performance. And we also need to support that ED as well. We need to ensure that the organization has sufficient capacity to do what it's supposed to and the resources that are required in order to make that happen. In terms of performance, we have to monitor what we're doing. And the goal is really to strengthen organizational impact and its performance. And I want to put an emphasis on organizational impact because that matters. And how people see the organization and the credibility that the organization actually has makes a difference. So in terms of performance, we provide financial, organizational, and program oversight. When I say we, I'm talking about the board here. We establish accountability for the ethical and the legal conduct that is absolutely required as a board member and as a staff member. We monitor and strengthen the organization's image and reputation. And this, of course, goes back to that credibility piece. And the more cred we have, the better we stand. And we ensure the organization's programs and services are going to fall within our mission boundaries and are actually getting at the sort of outcomes that we had hoped that they would get to. And then with governance, we need to develop and sustain this really effective structure of governance. And there's a lot of processes that happen here. So we need to recruit and train new board members. We have to establish the structure of the board itself. We need to regularly evaluate how the board is performing. And we need to implement the initiatives that actually increase how we govern the organization itself. So when we do these, and we do them at high levels of performance, it requires really high levels of commitment from your board. And you got to have a willingness or competence, and you got to have skill on the part of the board members that you're bringing into the table, because we need this with each board member, and we need it through the collective board. Because if we have one or both of those areas really weak or just entirely missing, we put the organization's mission and sometimes even the organization itself at risk. This is some really important information if you're ever considering, being a board member, or if you're currently serving on one. Because the legal responsibility in general, it rests with the board as a body, rather than with the individual, board member. But each member of a nonprofit board, as well as the board as a group or an entity, they're responsible for fulfilling three important legal duties. The first one is duty of care. And this requires members to be reasonably informed about how the organization's activities are occurring. They're to participate in some of the decisions, and they do it in good faith with the care of what we would call an ordinarily prudent person, and how that prudent person would act in a similar circumstance. And this really has to do with attendance at board meetings, with participation in the work of the board itself. Now, the duty of loyalty, that requires that the members exercise their power in the interest of the organization and not in their own interest or in the interest of another entity, particularly one in which they might have a formal relationship. And each board is expected to adopt policies that are related to, potential conflicts of interest. What came into my head was an issue not too long ago that I was dealing with, where there was a board member who owned a business that sold PCs, and this organization really needed the new personal computers, And the board member actually pushed the organization to purchase from his store, and there were better prices available elsewhere. And that's a challenge, and it, clearly not operating in the best interest of the organization itself. So the duty of obedience requires members, behave and comply with the federal, the state, and local laws. They need to adhere to the organization's bylaws, and they need to be basically the guardians of the organizational mission. Decisions to authorize activities beyond the mission could have some real serious implications, including some tax implications too. So beyond these legal duties, there's some newer standards for organizational governance that, they're kind of coming out. They're not in full force at the moment, but I suspect we're headed this way. And it includes effectiveness and efficiency along with transparency. The effectiveness piece just really means getting the results. Efficiency deals with the way in which boards actually use their resources, like the organizational funds, time set aside for meetings, stuff like that. And transparency refers to communication and information and the flow that actually enables both inside and outside parties to understand why and how we have arrived at some of the organizational decisions that we've arrived at. This is crucial in establishing and maintaining the trust out there in your community. We need to be as transparent as we possibly can, so nobody can, point a finger and say, those, I don't know what those folks are up to over there, but we should dig into that. There's no need. We'll be transparent, and you'll know everything that we're doing. Now, if you understand the three sort of main and overarching roles of any nonprofit board, you're pretty much going to be able to understand everything else that comes with board service. And these three roles include establishing the organizational identity, and they do it by determining the mission and the purpose of the organization, and then they come out advocating strongly and consistently for them. We need to ensure resources are both available, and when we talk about that, here is where the board actually chooses the executive director, ensures that there is enough finances available to do what we need to do, builds the board, and then enhances the overall standing and image of that board and the organization within and throughout our community. And then finally, an important role really is providing oversight by supporting and evaluating the ED, by monitoring and strengthening programs and services while we protect the assets of this organization, and then provide that financial oversight to make sure we are legally and ethically full of good integrity. These are, I kind of make a little light of it, but they're very serious roles for folks. And taking on a board role, it's a lot more than just saying, you know what, yeah, I'd really like to do that. Excuse me. Now, apparently, the board gods responsible for determining roles really had some sort of fetish with the number 3, because here we find the 3 Ds, Gs, Ts, and Ws of a board. So these acronyms I think they can help. They certainly help me remember, but we know the 3 Ds: the duty of care, the duty of obedience, and the duty of loyalty. And these duties make sure that a board member makes really good decisions, very prudent decisions, respects the law, and doesn't put their personal interest above the interest of the org. The 3 Gs, this is give, get, or get out. And a lot of boards expect their members to bring in some money, either by making a personal contribution, actively participating in some fundraising, or doing both. And if it doesn't happen, there are some boards that will ask you to resign. Now, the 3 Ts, this is treasure, time, and talent, and the 3 Ws, wealth, work, and wisdom. So besides participating in, making sure we got the finances, that's treasure and wealth, Our board members are really expected to participate in activities, time and work, and the final contribution to the board's knowledge and expertise, and that's talent and wisdom. There's a lot of threes of stuff. And Rita, there are, yeah, I understand you can't write that fast. I totally get you. There are handouts, and I know that Cindy and Chris will be making those available. You might even see some of them start popping up in the chat as we move forward. So I hear you, and I'll make sure that you're able to get this information. You guys are all welcome. All right. So, our favorite folks, the IRS, requires certain information from your organization to be submitted annually. And we do that through the 990, right? The Form 990. This is the return of organizations exempt from income tax. It is a big doc, 12 pages. It's got some other stuff, and it serves as a check to make certain nonprofit organizations are still actually qualified for that status. And to that point, the 990 asks about policies and procedures that really help ensure the nonprofit is conducting business in that really transparent way that's consistent with the whole idea of the exempt purpose, right? Specific governance policies encouraged by the IRS really work to limit some, potential abuse. It protects against some of the vulnerabilities that, that may exist, and it really prevents activities that could go beyond what's permitted as a nonprofit. So governance policies apply to the procedures that the board follows in order to carry out the responsibilities of the board. And these policies ensure that the nonprofit basically lives by internal standards as well as the laws that govern them. And some of this might be the code of ethics, a review of the executive director's performance. There are conflict of interest policies that really assure the board members' personal interests aren't interfering with the planning and decision making. And really, board members have a duty to disclose potential conflicts of interest every year. There are also, some other good governance practices. Maintaining corporate minutes of all the board meetings and committee meetings for committees that are actually authorized to act on behalf of the board, like an executive committee. And we'll talk a little bit more about committees in a minute. An annual review of a written policy, and to complete an actual questionnaire about those conflicts of interest that just helps, maybe trigger the memory that, oh, you know what, there was something this last year that might be a problem. This is also where we approve the executive director, the compensation package. And there is an important piece to this around documenting how the board actually determined that the compensation we're given to the ED is really appropriate and it's not excessive. Excuse me. It also requires the board to review a copy of that Form 990 before it's filed. And if you're a smaller nonprofit and you only file the 990N, the board needs to be sure about that annual filing requirement. They just need to know that this is something we need to do. And then disclosure to the public. This is the nonprofit's most recently filed annual returns that go to the IRS. We also want to include in that if the application for tax exemption and the 501c3 sort of award letter. So what should every nonprofit board member know about serving? Well, serving on a nonprofit board, it really serious legal, ethical, and fiduciary. And again, fiduciary is just a person or an organization that is acting on behalf of another person or persons, and they're putting the client's interests ahead of their own, with a duty to preserve the sort of good faith and the trust that is required if somebody else is going to be making decisions for another person. So being a fiduciary requires being both legally and ethically bound to act in somebody else's best interests. And board members, can be held accountable for dereliction of that duty. So I'm going to say that again. Board members can be held accountable for this dereliction of duty. You have to avoid conflicts of interest. You've got to take an active part in the decision making. And the board hires the ED and makes sure that he or she does not endanger the financial future of the organization or engage in any unlawful acts that could really put that organization in legal jeopardy. Not that executive directors run out and do that, but stuff happens out there. Board members are also expected to help support the organization financially and help raise the funds to do that work. They must understand that they're going to be involved in fundraising, and you don't have to donate, and you don't have to be the one that goes in for the ask. I can't do that. That's terrifying to me. But what we can do is we can donate our own money. We can find people who might be able to do that, even though we don't want to ask them for it. We can make our own pitches. We can set up and support others who are trying to do the fundraising. Maybe we need to make some phone calls. Maybe we want to, establish some sort of a day at the, a day at the races where, it's a fundraising event, and you don't have to do any of the, hey, I need money, but you can act as a support for those folks who are going to make those asks. And board members also need to understand the difference between the responsibility of the board and the responsibility of the staff, because often they walk this really fine line between being appropriately involved and then interfering with the staff. And I'm dealing with something like that right now. For instance, the board will set policy, and then the staff actually is the one who implements those policies. The board hires an ED, but that ED employs and supervises the rest of the staff, and the ED runs the organization as well. So to make sure that that board is running smoothly, the first board should set up a nominating committee, and that whole job is really going to be around finding new board members who can help expand that board and to fill the positions as they become available or they open up. Other committees, and again, we'll talk about this later, especially as we're starting, a finance committee to ensure that the organization is appropriately holding the money, remains solvent, and we need a development committee that helps us start fundraising. A good founding board will not micromanage that staff, but it'll concern itself with getting the organization stable, really stable financially, and then using each board member's contacts to help broaden the reach and the influence of that nonprofit. And this is why selecting board members who have some juice in the community is sometimes super duper important, because what we're trying to do really is mine those contacts, build that support, get some consistent credibility behind us, and maybe some community motivation, the momentum to really help this organization achieve the mission that it's set out to do. And as we get to building the board, we get some questions that we got to consider, like, how many board members does a startup nonprofit actually need? And, a minimum of 3, that's what folks say is typical, but there's going to be a minimum number on the state's incorporation document. And if you want to go beyond that number, it's really going to depend on the organization's needs itself, but you're going to have to be at least at that minimum number. And again, some folks say 3. I think there's a sort of a prevailing, knowledge that 5 is really where you want to be. But we also need to consider staggering those board member terms, because you want to make sure that, 1, you got fresh talent that's coming into the board, and 2, you don't want folks all leaving at the same time, because that just makes your job a lot harder in trying to replace those board members and get them up to speed and functioning in a way that doesn't cause some pretty serious hiccups within the board's operations. And you can do, with 3 board members, you can have one serve 1 year, somebody serves 2, a third could serve for 3. But you do want to specify in your articles of incorporation and your bylaws, and we'll talk about that too, what that maximum term is going to be for a board member going forward. It's also nice to have a mix of some kind of important core competencies. And those include things like, having a financial background, understanding marketing, having somebody who's really proficient tactically in your organization that can come and, tinker with your computer when you're really struggling. We want people who are entrepreneurs because those are the folks who are looking for other and new opportunities. Really helps to have somebody who understands the legal system. And it's helpful to have somebody who's got that kind of social service background as well. Now, having said all that, don't overlook the value of folks who may not have those professional backgrounds, because I think most of you realize, passion and being committed and hanging in there and, slogging through whatever it is that you need to, that's pretty important. And in fact, at times it's more important than having those professional skills. And we shouldn't just think of skills as the criteria for choosing our members. We're looking for things like passion. Is the person super passionate about what we're doing here? What about, are they willing to help with, rolling up their sleeves and diving into the nitty gritty of, getting this organization up and keeping it running? What about strong ties in the community? Because, if you're doing community services, you have somebody who's really connected, that's a cheerleader for you. That's a powerful force in your community who keeps you connected to that community. And adding diversity through age and gender and race and religion and the willingness to work with diverse people and, a desire to help that nonprofit raise money, all of those pieces are super important in giving your board and your organization the strongest and most broad chance of being successful and of addressing truly what is happening in your community in terms of the needs, the programs and the types of support that folks in that particular community are really going to need. And I think what is extraordinarily valuable for them in that community, because what might be valuable for folks in Denver, Colorado, may not be the same for folks in Nashville, Tennessee. It is that community that helps you get to that information. Now, a lot of folks volunteer to give back. Certainly, if you're a person in recovery, particularly from a substance use disorder, that's a big deal. Certainly is for me. They also nurture causes that they're really passionate about, and they'll contribute time and energy, expertise. They'll do that to things that matter. And some folks use it to build a resume. Some do it to add some business connections. Some of us are on boards because friends have asked us to. And it's an opportunity to expand that friendship. But if you're on a founding board, that's a little different and a lot more special. And they usually know who started that organization, and they will typically believe super strongly in what the organization is doing. And the board could be made up of those folks who were really interested in that mission early on, or it could be a group of folks who came up with the idea and then all just worked together to get it started. But either way, that founding board guides the organization as it organizes as this not-for-profit corporation and then applies to the IRS for their 501c3. Being on a founding board is hard work. Members need to be willing to give a lot of time to this and a lot of energy. And those first board members, they do a lot of work, and they also do a lot of fundraising. So the bottom line here is that the board of directors is the governing body for your organization. That board is just a group of people, but their passion is high for your organization's mission. And their goal is to bring their knowledge and their expertise and their skills into your organization in order to help it grow and evolve. And when they do that, we need them to grow and evolve as well. Now, a lot of boards still call themselves working boards, and they're more like an active group of volunteers than they are a sort of a governing entity. But a working board is still a governing board. And just like a governing board, a working board is responsible for that big picture strategy and the policies of an organization. But the members of a working board are the ones who actually implement the strategies. If you're on a governing board, not so much. Now, working boards have some challenges, obviously, and they are the most common in small organizations or in community groups that really don't have the funds to pay staff. The individual members of the board implement the organization's mission, but their reach is limited to the folks that are at the table, frankly. And this administrative burden, it can affect the board members' time and their attention, and it can even make the board less sort of attentive to the strategy needed to advance the mission, and it also makes folks less likely to go after larger projects. A working board can be super powerful if the board has enough members and if it secures some partnerships for those bigger projects and bigger pieces of stuff they're trying to do. But keep in mind that in order to implement those things, that board is still constrained by time and energy of the members that are currently seated. And we all know how easy it is to very rapidly become overwhelmed in your day job, and the things that can get put off as we work through the amount of stuff on our plate from our day job. Sometimes the board service is what takes a bit of a hit. And understand that with a governing board, members are focused only on the big picture. They work as a collective body. They do a lot of delegation of management tasks, and they do that to the paid staff within an organization. The board's members still have that individual responsibility, but today they're not boots on the ground. A governing boards manage financial plans, not the budget. And a working board, it does both. So remember, again, the governing board, it'll manage the financial plan, but it doesn't look at the budget. And a working board, it takes it all on. So to make the transition, really, when an organization gets enough resources that they're starting to hire paid staff, man, it's exciting. A working board can transition to a governing board, but it can get tricky. And trying to reassign folks to different duties, especially if the board is a little bit disorganized, or if members are kind of part of that, well, we've always done it this way crowd. It makes it a little more challenging. It's just really important that the board can stand by its work and that the members are organized enough to transfer all that information. And there's a lot. And, we're going to go through some of that too shortly. And all the resources, and make that all happen without anything falling through the cracks. That's a big lift. But regardless of how we classify the board, we know, and I think all of you do too, communication and organization are critical. That's true for almost everything that we do in our lives. And it's just really important that we have a good system in place that tracks and manages the activity of both the collective board and what each board member themselves are up to. So I'm going to talk a minute about some of the different board roles, because in order to function effectively, you need a strong and passionate leader. And this is the chairperson, right? We call them the president of the board or the chair of the board, but this is our chief elected officer. And as the leader, they got a ton of responsibilities. The vice chair, we call them the chair-elect or the vice president, typically supports the board chair. And you can just kind of think of the vice chair as the potential leader of the organization in the future. The role of a board secretary, it's critical to ensure smooth operation. And most commonly, the secretary ensures that the board members get the timely notices of the meetings. This is the person who records the meetings. I do a lot of stuff, but understand their duties go way beyond what I just told you. And they can vary depending on the organization that the secretary finds themselves in. And then finally, the board treasurer deals with finances, and they make the decisions regarding spending and investing, not unilaterally and not all by themselves. But you can imagine this is a demanding role. It has a lot of responsibility, but most importantly, this is the place where there is big opportunity to initiate change. Now, that board chair is the leader of that nonprofit board of directors. Because a nonprofit board has to make high-level strategic decisions that affect and impact the organization itself, that chair is mainly focused on helping the nonprofit achieve its mission long-term. Now, an ED, an executive director, in contrast, that's the person responsible for managing the operations of the kind of day-to-day stuff in the organization. All the initiatives. This is where the ED will work directly with employees, with the volunteers, with anybody in the organization that helps fulfill this mission. And some of these responsibilities can and they actually do overlap. And that's why it's really important that we clearly define each role. And most importantly, a board chair and the ED, the executive director, man, they better be in sync over the mission and the strategy and direction. If we're not, we can't be sure that we're both working towards the same goals. That's a problem. The executive director will assist that board in providing relevant material that will help the board make decisions. Their primary role is to ensure that the day-to-day stuff in the organization are operating in accordance with the mission that they've set and the direction set by the board itself. And the only employee that the board oversees, it's the ED. And all the other staff get hired, supervised, and fired by that ED. So we're going to dive just a little bit deeper here. One of the biggest differences between a board chair and an ED's responsibilities really around the scale of what they do. That chair is focused on those high-level strategic planning pieces directly with the board. The ED is the person hands-on in the organization. The board chair and the board itself, they're the ones who determine that big scope. They determine the goals, and they determine strategic direction of the organization itself. At that point, the ED then comes in and works with the people on the ground. This is staff and volunteers, accountants, marketers, fundraisers, key stakeholders, and they do it to turn those high-level goals into their reality. Now, another key difference is really around the length of tenure for board versus the ED. A board chair, and really all board members, really only serve a nonprofit for a few years. In fact, it's probably a best practice. Well, it is a best practice for boards to bring in some new people on a rotating basis. And typically you want to do that between 2 and 4 years, because that ensures that the strategic decisions and the knowledge needed to understand what's happening on the ground stays timely. Now, on the other hand, an executive director, they may be there until the earth cooled. And it allows them to be really highly skilled, both at working with and helping the board and running that organization. And a lot of times the ED really becomes a key resource for the board. And they use that to help locate and appoint new board chairs and new board members. And then a final key difference is really in the terms of responsibility. We talked a little bit about this already, but legally all board members, but especially the board chair, they have responsibility for the financial compliance of the organization. And that includes all the inbound and outbound transactions like donations, big gifts, and payroll. And the executive director manages a lot of these transactions, and they're typically responsible for finding and attracting some new donations and gifts, but they ain't legally responsible like the board is. That's a key difference. Now, we got a pretty clear understanding of the functions of the board and the roles that need to be fulfilled. So we need to fill that board. And in order to do that, we got to do some recruiting. And all that means is we need to, well, it's more than all that means. But what it does mean is that we need to identify, approach, vet, sort of investigate, and select a new member. So that's an awful big ask. And a lot of us don't have any clue where we would start, self-included. So generally speaking, what we want to do, we want to select board candidates who have values, interests, and skills that match our mission and our organizational needs. We do this a lot through vetting and having conversations with folks. It's really important that they're aligned. The governing board's composition, it really should reflect the diversity and the makeup of the community that it's serving. And that diverse board is going to be an asset, and it will strengthen how effective you are in your community when you are responding to some of the challenges as well as to some of the opportunities. And if we really want to recruit the best board, there's some steps that we need to take, and we can streamline some of them. But we need to develop a recruitment package, and that package needs some good information. We need a board member job description, and we need an application in that. We want to put letters of introduction from the executive director and the board chair. And those letters outline the skills that we're hoping to find in the particular board member that we're targeting, or the prospective board member we're targeting. We want to give them a list of the current members and their affiliations. Who are they? What are they doing? What's their day job? We want to make sure they have the vision, mission, and the value statement of our organization. They need the organizational bylaws. We're going to talk a little bit more about that again shortly. You should give a small history of the organization, what it is, how it came about. If there are specific things that you're going to require for that board membership, it should be included. If you've got any press release coverage, any press coverage at all of things that the organization has done, put that in there. And then a calendar of meetings that have the next board orientation, as well as what are the events over the next 90 days to 6 months the organization itself is going to be doing. Now, to make it all happen, it might just be the easiest to come at this thing in pieces or in steps. Because before you can start looking for the right board member, you got to figure out what you need. And this is going to help guide the whole recruitment process. So, when you're having these conversations and you're getting ready to reach out to somebody, you need to make sure that the title that you give the role actually reflects sort of the responsibilities that are going to be included with that position. If we don't do that, you wouldn't come to a job where they said, hey, we'd like to hire you, can't tell you what you're going to be doing, but when you get here, we'll show you. I think most of us would probably balk at that. If you want to find the best people, you got to reach out to potential candidates in as many ways as you can. If you are just waiting for them to come to you, you're going to miss some really good people. I can promise you that. Next, we got to create this process that helps us select, interview, and evaluate the candidates. So inviting them to attend a board meeting, having them come volunteer for an hour to just check out the organization, maybe sitting down with somebody who's been on the board for a couple of years that has some good historical and some insight about how things are going. And then step 5, this is where the rubber meet the road, folks. This is where we want to create a short list and we want to make a decision, but we don't want to race through that process. This is one of those things you really want to be deliberative around. And then once we get somebody recruited, but before we seat them as that official member, it's time to get them oriented. And it can be done in a bunch of different ways, but no matter what you do, a formal orientation is critical. It is as critical as when we're trying to integrate a peer into an organization that has never had a peer work there before. Critical. And whether it's a 2-hour session or a 2-day session, giving that overview of the organization's history, its evolution, the philosophies it has, the staffing, the finances. These are key things that board members really need to understand and then agree with before they actually sit down and start, functioning as a board member. Now, we said the board is really responsible for determining both the direction and the success of the organization. And because of that, we got to find the right people to help us make sure that we're recruiting. We got to come at this for knowledge. We want to look at candidates who understand our organization. Folks can't make a difference if they don't have some deep knowledge. And we need a recruit that may also have some specific professional or even service-related knowledge that might be lacking on the board. So when I said earlier, we kind of need to tell them what it is that we want them to do. This is what I'm talking about. And bringing on somebody who's got some special knowledge or who might have a useful background in maybe a legal background as an example. Trust me, that can be a game changer. I mean, it can really help the organization get beyond a challenge that, has the potential to shut you down. We want attributes like being proactive and patient and persistent. That makes a great board member. These guys will ask hard questions. Often folks can perceive things about our organizations that aren't, like blatantly obvious. And they need to readily react to the changes that can come to us. But when they do that, you kind of got to proactively work towards change as well. And all through this, you got to stay on message and on task to make sure that it actually happens. It is just, there's a lot there. And a dynamic board member, they need great people skills. They really need to work not just with board members, but with the EDs, with donors, with stakeholders. They basically need to be able to work with everybody. And that prospective board member also needs time to do the job. And given, think about the work-life balance here. There's an old adage that says, if you want something done, give it to a busy person. But I'm telling you, that doesn't hold true when we're talking about board members. And then finally, rapidly evolving government regulations and the tech that we're all dealing with are pushing nonprofit boards to do things a lot faster. So EDs often find themselves recruiting and then retaining change agents who help make those changes that the organization needs. So with a visionary ED and a visionary set of change agents, those folks can navigate your organization successfully with credibility way into the future. Dwayne, you're welcome. Good luck in that other meeting. Some additional areas to strengthen recruitment really include having knowledgeable and active board members. Keyword here is active. So we want to develop new member orientation about that organization and the responsibilities that come with it as a board member. We develop governance policies and procedures that carry out the board's legal responsibilities. This is also where we want a code of ethics and a way to review that ED's performance. We need a conflict of interest statement to assure our folks are not, their personal interests aren't getting beyond our organization or interfering with our planning, the decision making, or the operations. We need a board handbook or a manual. We need to decide on some of the board committees, their terms, and what that structure might look like. And last but not least, we really need to do succession planning, because folks retire and they leave and they move on. It's important. So when we're trying to orient new members, we have to start by really introducing them to just the basic roles and responsibilities of that service. And then we want to give them that really specific information about the org's mission and what the organization is actually doing. So if we're putting this orientation package together, mission, history, value statement, milestones in the org's history, particularly in relation to what the current priorities are, the bios of folks on the board and your key staff, a board member agreement, job description, and expectations of the board member, the conflict of interest policy, the recent financial report, and particularly any audited financials, the bylaws and that certificate of incorporation, the determination letter that comes from the IRS and our 501c3 status, the summary of a director's and officer's insurance coverage. I think every board member ought to take a look at that. Policies or other board resolutions that relate to the board's role in reviewing that CEO or the ED's compensation package, a travel reimbursement policy, particularly for board members, the whistleblower policy, if you have one, the annual report or other document that can list out who the donors are. That's going to be really important if you want to engage and continue building credibility. A board roster and a list of the committees that are in action, who serves on them, and a calendar of meetings that will give us what's happening for at least the next 6 months, and really what we want is a year. And when we're talking about pure run orgs, it gets a little bit different, because board members also need to understand things like, what are the organization's programs and services? What are the service population's recovery support needs? How is this organization funded? What are the strategic goals that we're looking at? How do we evaluate the services and supports? And not just evaluate them, how do we use that information to improve them? And what are the opportunities for client feedback? So, piece of cake, yes, we got this. We got this all. I told you there's a lot here, but honestly, it really isn't that hard. It just requires the knowledge. And once you have the knowledge, this can happen and you can make this happen. I want to talk a minute about committees. These are just groups of board members, sometimes staff members, and sometimes there's even volunteers. They just come together, they provide some expert guidance for the entire board. Most importantly, the board committee is a way to kind of leverage the knowledge of a bigger group of people in order to help the board make the best decision it can. And a lot of the work is done in committee, so that the full board meeting really gets to focus on the kind of report outs and then make some decisions. And these board committees allow the necessary work to get distributed evenly. No one person is going to have to take on all of the work that's required. Well, that's the goal anyway. We sure hope that doesn't happen. And it allows for really the best allocation of the talent in your organization to get the work done. And when you break your goals and responsibilities down into some pieces, particularly when you have a clear organizational structure, the board itself, it doesn't get bogged down worrying about who's going to do what, when that's going to happen, and how. We want them not to have to think about that at all. We'll handle that. And that's what the committee's for. Most nonprofit boards, the committees provide clearly defined responsibilities for very specific members, empowered committee members to work at their own pace, and then remove some of the routine tasks that often end up on the monthly agenda. Puts the skills and talents of your board members to the best use. Getting folks on the right seats on the organizational bus, as every one of you knows, it is essential. Without that, I mean, folks don't stay. They just don't stay. And then finally, researching and making recommendations and then presenting those options to the bigger board at large. And each committee that the board creates should have its own mission, its own reason for being. It should also have a defined set of responsibilities, because a committee without that can go on for a very long time and go down a number of rabbit holes before somebody eventually says, I think we should stop now. If board members serve on more than one committee, and if you find that they must, not that they want to, but that they must, you probably have too many committees. Most boards end up, on average, 9 to 16 members. I've seen boards as big as 26, I think. That's a huge board that's like herding cats when you try to work with them, but they got a lot of stuff done. And if you've got more than 4 committees, your board members themselves, they may feel like they got to serve on these multiple committees, and you really can lose some good people if the committee work isn't a good use of their time. Nobody wants to do stuff that, particularly when they're volunteering, that isn't, part of the passion of why they're there. Folks will do some admin work and they'll roll up their sleeves as long as they feel that their input is valuable in an organization that matters to them. This is why it's really crucial to have just the committees that you need. And as we think about this, the committee should really, the chair should have a proposed agenda, and we do all this. We do the preparation ahead of time. It's just like we would in any other meeting. The committee chair should aim to start and end on time. Follow that agenda, get some feedback from folks and their opinions, and listen to everybody, not just the folks who talk the most, right? The committees can be either a standing committee or an ad hoc committee. And a standing committee, they will work on an ongoing basis, and they may even be called in for the bylaws. An ad hoc committee, they're the ones who do a specific task or project, and then when that project's done, the committee goes away. There are a few other committees, a couple of them, the advisory committee, the executive committee, and a fundraising committee. Those are ones you see a lot. Marketing and public relations, also ones that, I think are really helpful for an organization. Now, we've talked a lot about the board of directors and what they should focus on. There's no way that any one person can remember it all. So we got to have a handbook. And particularly, a peer-run or recovery community organization, you need a comprehensive manual that also describes the philosophies along with the, kind of the logistics of the organization. So we want in that manual the board member and official roles and responsibilities, the board member names and affiliations, meeting procedures, the committee structure, the accountability for the ED, how the executive director's performance is monitored, the articles of incorporation, including the bylaws, a strategic and a business plan if we have them, fiscal and our accounting policies, and a fundraising plan. Now, honestly, the bottom line, a handbook here is invaluable in providing some really critical, but I think most importantly, that at-a-glance information to board members. And it's also important to understand this is not the organization's bylaws, and they often get confused. So in contrast to that handbook, bylaws are really considered the operating manual for the nonprofit. They're not filed publicly, but they do help add transparency and I think probably more importantly, accountability for the board. You need to update those bylaws and amend them if and when the organization does evolve and it does grow. And these bylaws, they'll consist of things like the duties and roles of the board members, the rules really around how the board functions and how big it is, the rules regarding the procedures for actually electing the directors, for holding meetings, and for appointing new board officers, how they're going to use funds from grants that come in. Shoot, that's a hugely important one. A description of the conflict of interest procedures and the policies that the organization has there. And then anything else that might be relevant in terms of how we're going to govern the organization itself. Nonprofit governance issues often are addressed by state nonprofit law. And the bylaws of the organization, they can be customized based on your requirements, but they can't violate the state law. All right, succession planning is the process of finding a new leader to replace or succeed a current leader. And at its best, it's proactive and a systematic investment in how we build sort of a pipeline of leaders within an organization. And it also helps us identify some strong external folks as well. So that when we do have to make a transition, whether it is planned or, it came up as a crisis, everybody's ready to act. And this planning lets a nonprofit respond to strategic changes that can create those new leadership needs. And excuse me, and also be prepared for those transitions whenever they might occur. What this does is it embeds this leadership development idea as a core organizational system rather than this, ad hoc process. This organization is always ready for what we know is inevitable change. And if, from a peer perspective, to me, having this as a core organizational piece means that, we baked it in. We have baked this thing in, and our goal, honestly, is to make us all leaders. All of us can lead in our recovery efforts in some way. So when we build this as a core organizational piece, again, baked in, and how empowering to those of us who are coming into that organization, particularly those of us who may not have been, working very long or, in earlier recovery. And this is a really great opportunity for us. That we're going to be trained as potential leaders. Wow. I mean, honestly, it's like the icing on the cake, right? So we think through how the organization's leadership needs to evolve, particularly as we identify future leaders and activities that strengthen the leadership capacity. That's the core of our planning. And while our futures are uncertain, having that plan gives the organization the ability to develop a leader intentionally. And we do that by engaging our senior folks. It's really essential we have consensus among our CEO and our senior leadership team about the importance of proactive leadership development. And again, in an RCO, I can't imagine that this would be a hard sell. The group should set expectations, put processes in place, and then we got to hold the organization accountable for making it happen. We need to map out a vision of what that future leadership looks like. And we need to understand those capabilities required to get the organization's strategy implemented. When we have that understanding, we can assess the potential of our current staff to actually become the future leaders and meet the needs that are, always changing. Developing future leaders really is around identifying those folks and diagnosing and developing needs that help us build in processes that actually cultivate that development. That's why I said earlier, if we can bake in this idea of leadership capacity, my gosh, that's fantastic. We need to be able to fill gaps. There's instances where leadership is just not going to be able to be fulfilled by who we have right now. That's not it's not disparaging to anybody on the team. It's just that sometimes, there's a particular seat on the bus that none of us can fill right now. So we need to have effective hiring and onboarding practices that allow us to integrate new leaders into our organization. We need to monitor, improve the process that we use to develop those leaders. And like most processes, it's iterative, right? It builds on itself. So generally speaking, the succession planning is a process we need to ensure that we get the essential roles in an organization covered no matter what. The board needs to have policies and procedures for recruitment and replacement of those leaders. And the policies really need to cover emergency plans for temporary leadership as well. You either have temporary or planned, it doesn't matter, because you just never know. Somebody might get hit by a bus on the way to the work in the morning, and we suddenly have an emergency. And God forbid that happens to anybody. But my point is, we need to be ready. Okay, the board is ultimately in control of the nonprofit corporation. Because of that, they're responsible for the actions. Board members should be aware and prepared to accept those legal duties and responsibilities. It's a big one. They need to share the founders or the founding group's vision. They need capacity. This is important, to serve on the board. Not all of us have it. Folks really want to do stuff that seems like they might have the space to do it when they're saying, yes, I'd love to be on the board, but it turns out, probably not as much. They should bring a really valuable skill and a perspective to that organization. They should be team players who work well with others. And importantly, board members individually, they don't have any authority unless they get it delegated by the board chair. But they do have collective authority. And when they have that, they manage the organization and they can exercise all the powers that come with that. They should also have a basic understanding of those legal requirements that are connected to a 501c3. They should be amenable to creating and adopting sets of governing documents and policies that help with the initial business plan and that's going to be incorporated into the recognition. It's a form, I think 1023. This is where you ask for the 501c3 status. And some of those prospective directors need to be willing and capable to take on additional stuff. Again, that work-life balance becomes important. And all the board members, prospective or sitting, have to be vetted. And a founder or founding group really needs to review the evidence of how that happens based on the criteria that we just rattled off here. Finally, the number of directors should meet any minimum requirements that occur under state law. And honestly, it should include at least 3. Other folks, again, suggest 5. But you do that in order to avoid this private benefit concern that a small number on the board might trigger for folks. So as we bring it to a close, just a few final things to consider. Who sets the board meeting agenda? Where's that coming from? And how do we get agenda items on that for consideration? What's the board's role in advocacy and in public relations and in community outreach? What are the terms of service? And is there an option for being elected to another term? Does insurance cover the board member? This is a good one to ask. And if so, what kind of insurance? Does the organization expect board members to make financial contributions to the organization? And if that's the case, what is that minimum amount that they are going to require from us? And I just got a low system resources warning on my computer. Hopefully we'll make it through. But if I do disappear, I will be back as fast as I can get here. Now, I've said repeatedly this morning, whole books have been written about these things. I threw a bunch of information at you, but it's all important. The good news is there's a lot of help online. I suspect this training might have opened your eyes a bit and got you a basic understanding, but I'm telling you, Google will be your best friend. And any questions that you might have about board development, composition, you're going to find those answers on Google. It's where I found most of these. I've got the experience of this, but most of this I put together by putting my time into Google, using some of the resources that I've had over the last 10 years and doing the work, and confirming using Google that what I was sharing with everybody was still accurate. So, we're going to put together this strong, appropriate, aligned, and responsible board. And sometimes it feels really overwhelming, but you know how we eat the elephant, right? It's one bite at a time. We just took a big old bite of board development. And I do appreciate everybody's time and hanging in there with me. I got one more thing. Let's do this again and see where we land, okay? I'll move us through this pretty quick. So, the board is formally recognized as a legal entity responsible for the organization. True or false? Pop it in the chat. A conflict of interest or unethical behavior might be grounds for removing somebody from the board. True or false? Boards can't fire Many boards establish not only board terms, but also term limits, such as 2-year terms with a limit of 3 consecutive terms. True or false? Boards can't fire an ED. The executive director does not report to the board. An annual assessment provides a straightforward, you guys are rocking it, I'm telling you. An annual assessment provides a straightforward way for board members to provide feedback on the ED and the organization's performance. Sweet. Boards bear no fundraising responsibilities. Go Stephanie, go Carl, go Karis. You guys are nailing it. All right. The role of the board committee is to prepare recommendations for the board's approval. Constituency, skills, gender, sexual orientation, race, and ethnic background, all important characteristics considered in board member recruitment. And governance refers to directing the day-to-day administrative programmatic activities. You guys have nailed it. So I can tell you 1, 2, and 3, they're true. 4, 5, they're false. 6 is true. 7 false. 8 is true. 9 is true. And 10 is false. And with that, I think we are here. Thank you, guys. It's a lot of material. I know it took an awful lot to get through. I appreciate your patience. Chris?
Thank you, Stephen. I'm drowning from the fire hose of information. So I'm so glad we recorded this session. Carl, you asked a question. Did you want to unmute or I can read it for you? I can see him, but no, you're muted.
I think my question was, did we talk about electing the board chair and then how does that position relate to the CEO or ED?
So, Carl, we did indeed. And what we did, I'm going to see if I can zip us back here. This will be recorded and I think you're going to end up with a copy of this slide deck anyway. But here's what we're talking about. The difference between, excuse me, sorry, I'm a little too far. This is where we start talking about, the role of the board chair versus the ED. And you're exactly right. I mean, what we're saying here is that, the board chair is the person that makes the kind of high level decisions. They are the sort of, subject matter expert. They have the financial responsibility versus the ED, who is the person making the on-ground stuff. That is the long-term resource. And they have this, the management responsibility for them, as you can see, is different than the financial responsibility from the board chair. But the ED is the one who, deals day to day with what's happening in the organization itself. The board and the board chair, their goal or their job is to monitor the performance of the executive director to make sure that the compensation that the ED is getting is appropriate and not excessive. And if things need to be done differently, where we need to replace our ED, because that sometimes happens, that's the board and the board chair's role and responsibility to make that happen. So I
Thank
don't
you.
know if that got to you. Is that
Yes, thank
answer,
you.
Russ?
Yes,
You're
thank you.
welcome. My pleasure. Absolutely.
Well, and Stephen, is it okay to, is it typical that on a founding board, so the very first board of an organization might assign people roles of chair, secretary, treasurer, and then in the future, those positions would be elected? Or
Absolutely.
okay.
That's absolutely right. Because, think about a founding board. And Stephanie, sorry, I'll get to your question. It just took me by surprise. And I'll respond to that in a minute. But that founding board often, and this is what I've seen in, particularly through brass tacks work, when I was working with a lot of small startup, both PROs and RCOs, peer runs and recovery community organizations. And most of them had founding boards, and most of the folks were just people who were super passionate and knew each other. It was like a group of friends who said, this is a big need. We don't have it. Let's make it happen in our community. And what will happen is, the founding board has a period of time where, they have some grace to kind of get it together and start making really electing properly the board members who begin to replace founding board members. And it's got all kinds of stuff with it, right? Some people don't want to leave. There's some folks who really, feel really strongly about how and what they want that organization to do. So, there can be some challenges there, but that transition is critical, and it needs to move from founding to working, because what ends up happening with the founding board is that if there are challenges that begin to split how people see the mission, it has the potential to damage friendships and relationships. It can get kind of sticky for people. It's a lot easier to be able to elect the board member, hold the board member accountable. Ain't nothing personal here. This is what we do. This is what your role is in the board. That becomes a lot harder when you got to go home tonight with the person on the board that you just chewed out for something, right? So it matters. And yes, that is the, sort of the policy, or the process. Get them in, get them together. And then as we begin to identify the needs, begin identifying, electing, and seating those folks who will basically give us the pieces of organizational expertise that we're currently lacking. And Stephanie, I'm looking, as a founding working board, our attempt at strategic planning kind of sputtered to a halt because you continued those day-to-day operations. And this is exactly what I was saying when I said, we are going to overwhelm people because there is no split between the two. And so for your founding board, probably the most important thing we could have done was to finish the strategic planning and then set up a plan so that you are able to move out of the founding board status and move really fully into working board. Once you're there, once you're at a working board, to me, that's the meat and taters of the organization, and you're there. Those big governing boards, where you have honest to God, those for me are giant behavioral health organizations. I don't see a lot of that governing board piece in the small, PROs and RCOs that I've worked in. It's there, but I don't see it as much. Mostly it's working boards, people really committed. They care, and they want to do it right. And that's what they do.
Well, we are right at the end of our time. And I just want to, Stephen, could you go to the very last slide? We'll be sending.
I can, I'm so sorry.
No. We will be sending out a link. So we'll be sending an email following today's event that'll include a curated list of resources that Stephen pulled together. And then we'll also include a link to an evaluation about today's training.
I think I might have screwed that up.
That's okay. We'll send out the link. No big deal.
Awesome.
We'll get you a link. And today was just us dipping our toes into were people in need of board development training, and I'm hearing a resounding yes. So our intention is to break down a lot of these key concepts and do deeper dives into these. So this is like overarching, what is it? How do I do it? Who's responsible for what? And then we're going to work, hopefully with Stephen and his team, to break down these concepts so we can take a little more time and really have a more question and answer and allow you to get the details that you need. So appreciate everyone being here. Thank you, Stephen. You are a wealth of information. Super exciting. I love this topic. Boards are like a soul in an organization. Don't overlook it.
That's right. That's right.
Yeah. Any parting words, Stephen?
Listen, I love this work. And, as a person in long-term recovery, I know how important our organizations are to continue our ability to remain in recovery. I need you as much as you need me. In any way I can support the development and ongoing operations, I'm there. So I will be back.
Nice. Well, thanks so much, everybody. Like I said, just look for that email. You'll get it this afternoon with those curated resources, a link to an evaluation that tells SAMHSA, yes, I love this training. I want more of it. And then you'll hear more from us. So keep your eyes posted to our website. And we'll be doing more trainings like this. Thanks so much.
Thanks all.
Yes,
Thank you.
Great
Have a
day.
lovely day.